Kim Ji-ho wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crouched beside the ancient stone wall. The heat on this remote planet was unbearable, but the alien symbols carved into the rock were unlike anything he had ever seen. As a xenoarchaeologist, he had spent years studying ruins across the galaxy, but these markings seemed different. They pulsed with a faint energy that made his scanner beep wildly. "Just a few more photos," he muttered to himself, adjusting his camera to capture the intricate patterns. The symbols looked almost alive, glowing softly in the dim light of the planet's twin suns. Ji-ho had been working alone on this dig for 3 weeks, funded by a small research grant that barely covered his basic supplies. But discoveries like this made all the hardship worth it. He reached out to trace one of the larger symbols with his finger, hoping to understand its texture and composition. The moment his skin touched the carved stone, everything changed. The symbol flared with brilliant white light, and suddenly the entire wall began to hum with energy. Lines of power raced across the surface, connecting symbol to symbol in a web of glowing patterns. What the hell? Ji-ho stumbled backward, but it was too late. The wall had transformed into something that looked like a doorway made of pure light. Wind began rushing toward the portal, pulling at his clothes and equipment. He tried to run, but the suction was too powerful. His feet left the ground, and he was pulled helplessly toward the swirling vortex of energy. The last thing he remembered was tumbling through what felt like a tunnel of stars before everything went black. When consciousness returned, he found himself standing in what appeared to be the most magnificent palace he had ever seen. Crystal pillars stretched impossibly high, and the ceiling seemed to be made of liquid starlight. The air smelled of exotic flowers and something else he couldn't identify. But what really caught his attention were the hundreds of beings staring at him in complete silence. They were tall and elegant, with skin that shimmered like blue moonlight, and intricate silver, patterns that traced across their faces and hands. They wore flowing robes that seemed to be made of condensed light itself, and their eyes were large and luminous, filled with shock and something that might have been fear. Ji-ho looked down at himself and nearly gasped. Instead of his dusty archaeology clothes, he was now wearing elaborate ceremonial robes similar to those worn by the aliens around him. The fabric felt impossibly smooth and seemed to shift colors as he moved. How had this happened? Where was he? At the center of the vast hall stood 2 figures on a raised platform. One was clearly a female of the same species as the others, but she wore a crown that sparkled with what looked like captured starlight. Her beauty was otherworldly, with features that seemed carved from perfect marble. Beside her stood a male figure, taller and more imposing, with darker markings across his blue skin and an expression of pure rage. The female, who could only be some kind of princess, was staring at Ji-ho with wide eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of surprise and something else. Hope, perhaps. The male beside her had his hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice echoed through the silent hall like thunder. The words were in a language Ji-ho didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably angry and threatening. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of alien speech that rose and fell like waves. Through it all, the princess remained silent, her gaze fixed on this unexpected human who had somehow appeared in the middle of what was clearly her wedding ceremony. Ji-ho realized with growing horror that he had just crashed the most important day of an alien princess's life, and from the looks on everyone's faces, this was either going to be very interesting or very deadly. Princess Nara felt her heart racing as she stared at the strange being who had just appeared in her wedding ceremony. For months she had dreaded this day, knowing she would be forced to marry Duke Corvain, a man she despised. The Duke was cruel and power-hungry, caring only about gaining control over her father's throne. She had spent countless sleepless nights, wishing for some miracle that would free her from this fate. And now, impossibly, that miracle had arrived in the form of a small, brown-haired creature wearing ceremonial robes. The human looked just as confused as everyone else, his dark eyes darting around the hall like a trapped animal. But Princess Nara saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. Unlike the calculating coldness in Duke Corvain's eyes, this stranger's face showed genuine concern and kindness. The Duke's voice boomed across the hall, his words dripping with rage. What is the meaning of this interruption? Guards, remove this filthy creature from our sacred ceremony. His silver markings pulsed with anger, and his tall frame seemed to grow even more imposing as he stepped forward menacingly. But Princess Nara had spent years studying the ancient laws of her people, hoping to find some loophole that might save her. Now, for the first time in her life, that knowledge could actually help her. She raised her hand, and her voice rang out clear and strong across the silent hall. "Wait!" she declared, causing every head to turn toward her. "By the ancient law of dual claiming, written in the sacred texts of our ancestors, when two suitors present themselves during a bonding ceremony, the bride has the right to choose between them through the traditional trials." A collective gasp rose from the assembled nobles. Many of them had forgotten about the old laws, which hadn't been invoked for over 3 centuries. The Duke's face turned an even deeper shade of blue as he realized what she was doing. "You cannot be serious, Princess," Duke Corvain snarled. "This creature is not even of our species. It's a primitive being that barely deserves to breathe the same air as us. The law was written for Veltharian nobles, not for alien insects." The princess lifted her chin defiantly. "The law makes no mention of species requirements. It simply states that any being who appears in ceremonial robes during the moment of binding may be considered a valid suitor. As you can all see, this being wears the traditional robes of our ceremony." Murmurs spread through the crowd as nobles began whispering among themselves. Some looked outraged, others appeared curious, and a few seemed almost amused by this unprecedented situation. The human, meanwhile, was looking back and forth between the princess and the duke, clearly understanding that something important was happening, but having no idea what. High Chancellor Viridian, the oldest member of the Veltharian Council, stepped forward. His ancient voice carried the weight of centuries as he spoke. "The princess is correct. The law of dual claiming is indeed still valid, regardless of how archaic it may seem. However," he paused, his luminous eyes studying the human carefully, "the trials were designed to test Veltharian capabilities. Can this alien even understand our language, let alone complete the sacred trials?" Duke Corvain's laugh was cold and bitter. "Exactly my point, Chancellor. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Very well. If the princess insists on invoking this ridiculous law, let the creature attempt the trials. When it fails miserably, as it surely will, we can proceed with the proper ceremony." The Duke turned to face Jiho directly, his silver markings now glowing with malicious pleasure. "Human, if that's what you call yourself, do you accept the challenge? Of the 3 trials of worthiness, be warned that failure means not just rejection, but exile from our empire forever." Jiho swallowed hard, still not understanding the words, but clearly recognizing a challenge when he saw one. The princess stepped closer to him, and for a moment their eyes met. In that brief instant, he saw something that made his decision for him. Behind her regal bearing and alien beauty, he saw the same trapped desperation he had felt so many times in his own life. Without fully understanding what he was agreeing to, Kim Jiho nodded his head. The great hall transformed before Jiho's eyes, as crystalline panels rose from the floor, creating a circular arena filled with floating holographic displays. Complex geometric patterns danced in the air, shifting and changing like living puzzles made of light. The Veltharian nobles gathered around the elevated viewing platforms, their luminous eyes fixed on the human who had dared to challenge their most sacred traditions. High Chancellor Viridian's voice echoed through the chamber as he explained the rules. Although Jiho couldn't understand the alien language, a strange device was placed near his ear that somehow translated the words into his mind. The trial of mind consists of 3 strategic challenges. You must solve each puzzle within the time limit or face immediate failure. Duke Corvain stood with his arms crossed, a cruel smile playing across his lips. "This should be entertaining," he muttered to his supporters. "Watch as this primitive creature's tiny brain struggles with problems that challenge even our greatest minds." The first puzzle materialized in front of Jiho as a 3-dimensional maze of light. The walls shifted constantly, creating new paths while closing others. Glowing symbols appeared at various points, and it seemed he needed to collect them in a specific order to reach the center. Several Veltharian spectators nodded approvingly, recognizing this as a test that had stumped many of their own scholars. Jiho stared at the floating maze, feeling completely overwhelmed. The logical pathways that the Veltharians would normally use were beyond his understanding. But as he watched the patterns shift, something clicked in his mind. This reminded him of the archaeological sites he had explored, where ancient builders had created complex layouts to confuse invaders. Instead of trying to solve the maze through pure logic, Jiho began to think like the people who had built it. He noticed that certain symbols appeared more frequently than others, and some walls changed faster than others. Drawing on his years of studying ancient civilizations, he started to see the maze not as a puzzle, but as a story told in architecture. "What is he doing?" whispered one of the nobles as Jiho began moving in seemingly random directions. Rather than following the obvious paths, he was taking routes that appeared to lead nowhere. But gradually a pattern emerged. He was collecting the symbols not in the order they appeared, but in the sequence they had been created. The Veltharians watched in growing amazement as Jiho reached the center of the maze in record time. He had solved it not through their advanced mathematical principles, but by understanding the mind of its creator. Princess Nara leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued by this unconventional approach. The second challenge was even more complex. A massive holographic display showed what appeared to be a star system with multiple planets, moons, and space stations. Resources needed to be distributed between different colonies, but the supply lines kept changing, and various political factions were making conflicting demands. Most Veltharians would approach this through careful calculation and diplomatic protocol. Jiho studied the display, then did something that shocked everyone. He began dismantling the entire system, moving colonies to different locations and completely reorganizing the trade routes. The nobles gasped in horror, thinking he was destroying the puzzle entirely. "He's ruining everything," Duke Corvain shouted. "This proves that humans are nothing but destructive savages." But Princess Nara was watching more carefully. She noticed that Jiho wasn't destroying the system randomly. He was rebuilding it from scratch, eliminating the inefficiencies that had been built into the original design. When he finished, the resource distribution was not only solved, but optimized beyond what any Veltharian had ever achieved. The final puzzle appeared as a complex diplomatic scenario involving multiple alien species with conflicting interests. Traditional Veltharian wisdom would require careful negotiation and compromise. But Jiho surprised everyone again by suggesting something radical. Instead of trying to satisfy everyone's demands, he proposed creating entirely new opportunities that hadn't existed before. His solution involved establishing joint research projects that would benefit all species while addressing their underlying concerns. It was creative thinking that the rigid Veltharian political system had never considered. As the trial concluded, the hall fell silent. High Chancellor Viridian spoke slowly, his ancient voice filled with wonder. "In 300 years of administering these trials, I have never seen solutions like these. The human has passed the trial of mind not through superior intellect, but through a completely different way of thinking." Princess Nara's eyes sparkled with genuine excitement as she looked at Jiho. For the first time in her life, she had met someone who could see possibilities where others saw only limitations. Tiki. Combat arena materialized around Jiho like something from a science fiction movie. The floor shifted from crystal to metal to what felt like soft sand beneath his feet. Holographic obstacles appeared and disappeared randomly, creating a constantly changing battlefield. Energy barriers hummed to life, dividing the space into different sections while floating platforms moved through the air like mechanical birds. Duke Corvain stepped into the arena, and Jiho's heart sank. The alien noble was nearly 8 feet tall, with muscles that rippled beneath his blue skin like steel cables. His silver markings pulsed with energy, and when he flexed his hands, Jiho could see claws that looked sharp enough to cut through metal. This wasn't going to be a fair fight by any stretch of the imagination. "Behold the pathetic creature that dares to challenge Veltharian supremacy," Duke Corvain announced, his voice booming across the arena. "I will end this farce quickly and show everyone why inferior species should know their place." The watching nobles murmured their agreement. Many had been impressed by Jiho's performance in the mental trial, but physical combat was different. Here, raw power and speed would determine the winner, and no amount of clever thinking could overcome the basic facts of biology. Princess Nara watched from her elevated platform, her hands clenched tightly. She had hoped that the human's unconventional thinking might give him an advantage, but looking at the size difference between the two fighters, she began to fear she had condemned an innocent being to serious injury or worse. A crystal chime rang out, signaling the start of the trial. Duke Corvain immediately lunged forward with incredible speed, his claws extended to rake across Jiho's chest. But the human was already moving, diving to the side and rolling behind one of the shifting obstacles. The Duke's claws scraped against the barrier, sending sparks flying. "Running already?" the Duke taunted, easily vaulting over the obstacle. "There's nowhere to hide in here, little worm." Jiho's mind raced as he dodged another swipe. He couldn't match the Duke's strength or speed, but years of working in dangerous archaeological sites had taught him to think quickly and use whatever tools were available. He noticed that the arena's obstacles weren't just random decorations. They were responding to movement and energy, creating new configurations based on the fighter's actions. Instead of trying to fight the Duke directly, Jiho began running in a specific pattern around the arena. To the watching nobles, it looked like he was simply fleeing in panic. But he was actually studying how the environment reacted to different types of movement and energy signatures. The Duke pursued him relentlessly, growing more frustrated with each missed attack. His silver markings were now glowing brightly with anger, and his movements were becoming more aggressive, but less controlled. Jiho noticed that the Duke's energy was causing the arena's systems to respond in predictable ways. Suddenly, Jiho stopped running and began moving in a completely different pattern. He started using the floating platforms not as escape routes, but as launching points. When the Duke tried to follow him onto one platform, Jiho had already leaped to another, causing the first platform to shift away and leave the Duke stranded, temporarily. "Clever," Princess Nara whispered, beginning to understand what the human was doing. Jiho continued his strategy, using the arena's own systems against his opponent. He triggered energy barriers to appear between himself and the Duke, forcing the larger alien to waste energy, breaking through them. He caused the floor to shift to different textures at just the right moments, making the Duke stumble and lose his footing. The watching nobles began to murmur with interest rather than mockery. They were seeing something they had never witnessed before. The human wasn't trying to overpower his opponent through brute force. Instead, he was turning the entire arena into his weapon. Duke Corvain, realizing what was happening, roared in frustration. "Stop running and fight me like a warrior!" But Jiho had learned something important about his opponent. The Duke's anger was making him predictable. Every time Jiho triggered a trap or used the environment cleverly, the Duke's rage grew stronger, and his tactics became more straightforward and easier to anticipate. The climax came when Jiho managed to position himself on a platform directly above the Duke. Instead of trying to attack from above, he triggered a sequence of environmental changes that caused multiple barriers to appear simultaneously. The Duke found himself trapped in a cage of energy, exhausted from chasing his elusive opponent around the arena. As the final chime sounded, ending the trial, Duke Corvain stood panting heavily, while Jiho remained relatively fresh. The human had won not through superior strength, but through superior strategy, and an understanding of the battlefield that even the arena's designers hadn't anticipated. High Chancellor Viridian's voice carried a note of genuine respect as he announced the results. "The trial of strength is complete. Victory goes to the one who proved that true strength lies not in the power of one's body, but in the wisdom to use all available resources." Several nobles who had been skeptical of the human were now looking at him with new interest. Princess Nara's smile was radiant as she realized that this strange being from another world might actually have a chance of winning her freedom. The arena dissolved around them, replaced by a simple circular platform surrounded by floating seats where the Viltharian nobles gathered in perfect silence. This trial was different from the others. There were no puzzles to solve, no physical challenges to overcome. just Jiho standing alone in the center, with hundreds of alien eyes watching his every move. High Chancellor Viridian's ancient voice filled the space. The trial of heart is the most sacred of our 3 tests. Here, you must speak from your deepest truth and convince us why you are worthy of Princess Nara's hand in marriage. Many great warriors and brilliant minds have failed this final challenge because they could not touch the hearts of our people. Duke Corvain stepped forward first, his tall frame commanding attention as he began his speech. His voice boomed with confidence as he listed his accomplishments, his victories in battle, his vast wealth, the political alliances his marriage to the princess would create. He spoke of the powerful children they would have and how their union would strengthen the Veltharian Empire for generations to come. The nobles nodded approvingly at his words. This was exactly what they expected to hear. Marriage, in their culture, was a strategic alliance between families, a way to consolidate power and resources. Duke Corvain was offering everything their society valued most. When the Duke finished, he stepped back with a satisfied smirk, clearly believing he had already won. The nobles murmured their approval, discussing the practical benefits of his proposal. Princess Nara sat rigidly in her elevated seat, her face carefully neutral, but Jiho could see the sadness in her luminous eyes. Now it was Jiho's turn. He walked slowly to the center of the platform, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He had no wealth to offer, no political connections, no military victories to boast about. According to every standard these people valued, he was completely worthless as a potential husband. But as he looked up at Princess Nara, he remembered something his grandmother had told him years ago. The heart recognizes truth, even when the mind cannot understand it. Jiho took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent hall. I have no riches to offer Princess Nara. I have no armies, no political power, no great achievements that would benefit your empire. If you judge me by your standards, I am nothing. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. This was not how these speeches typically began. Duke Corvain's smirk widened, thinking the human was admitting defeat. But, Jiho continued, his voice growing stronger, I can offer her something that I believe is more valuable than all the wealth in the galaxy. I can offer her choice. A ripple of confusion passed through the audience. Princess Nara leaned forward, slightly, her attention now completely focused on the human below. Where I come from, Jiho said, we believe that marriage should not be a transaction between families or a political arrangement between strangers. We believe it should be a choice made freely by 2 people who care about each other, who want to build a life together not because they have to, but because they want to. The translator in his ear was working overtime as shocked whispers began to spread through the crowd. These concepts were foreign to Veltharian culture, almost revolutionary in their implications. Princess Nara, Jiho said, turning to address her directly, I don't know you well enough to claim that I love you. That would be dishonest. But in the short time we've spent together, I've seen something in your eyes that I recognize. You want the freedom to choose your own path, to make your own decisions about your life and your future. Princess Nara's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the arms of her chair. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. No one had ever asked what she wanted. If you choose me, Jiho continued, I promise you this. I will never try to control you or make decisions for you. I will never see you as property to be owned or a prize to be won. I will respect your thoughts, your dreams, and your right to be exactly who you are. And if someday you decide that you want a different life, I will support that choice too, even if it breaks my heart. The hall had gone completely silent. Even Duke Corvain's smirk had faded as he realized the human was saying something that resonated deeply with many of the listeners, especially the younger nobles, who had also been forced into arranged marriages. This is what humans call love, Jiho said, his voice now filled with passion. Not ownership, not obligation, but partnership between equals. 2 people choosing each other every day, not because they have to, but because they want to. This is what I offer Princess Nara, not a cage made of gold, but wings to fly wherever her heart desires. When he finished speaking, the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Princess Nara had tears streaming down her face, her composure finally broken by words that spoke directly to everything she had secretly dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. High Chancellor Viridian spoke slowly, his ancient voice thoughtful. "In all my years, I have never heard such words in a trial of heart. You offer nothing that our society values, yet you offer everything that the heart desires." Princess Nara stood up, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the assembly. "I have made my choice." The private chambers where Princess Nara led Jiho were unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls seemed to be made of living crystal that pulsed gently with soft blue light, and the furniture appeared to float just inches above the floor. Through massive windows, he could see 3 moons hanging in an alien sky filled with colors that had no names on Earth. Princess Nara dismissed her guards and attendants with a gesture, leaving them completely alone for the first time since this bizarre adventure had begun. She moved to the window, her silhouette elegant against the starlight, but Jiho could see the tension in her shoulders. "Princess," Jiho began carefully, "I need you to know something important." She turned to face him, her luminous eyes reflecting the crystal light. "What is it?" Jiho took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say might sound crazy even by the standards of his current situation. "Just because I passed those trials doesn't mean you're stuck with me. I meant what I said during the trial of heart. You should be free to choose your own path, and that includes choosing to reject me if that's what you want." Princess Nara stared at him in complete silence for several long moments. Then, to his surprise, she began to laugh. Not the polite, controlled laughter he might have expected from royalty, but genuine, delighted laughter that filled the room with warmth. "Do you have any idea how strange you are?" she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "In my entire life, no one has ever offered to give me a choice about anything. My food, my clothes, my education, my friends, my future husband, everything has always been decided for me by other people who claimed to know what was best." She walked closer to him, and Jiho noticed that she was actually quite a bit taller than him, something that had been hidden by the ceremonial platforms during the wedding ceremony. Her presence was both regal and surprisingly warm. "And now," she continued, "a complete stranger from another world wins the right to marry me, and his first act is to tell me I don't have to marry him at all. You really are the most peculiar being I've ever met." Over the following days, as they worked together to navigate the complex political situation his victory had created, Jiho discovered that Princess Nara was far more than just a beautiful face trapped in a loveless marriage. She was incredibly intelligent, with a sharp wit that could cut through political nonsense faster than any sword. She had been secretly studying not just human culture, but dozens of other alien civilizations, fascinated by concepts like individual freedom and personal choice. "My tutors always told me these ideas were primitive and dangerous," she explained as they walked through the palace gardens. "The plants here were unlike anything on Earth, with flowers that sang softly in harmonious voices and trees that bent their branches to provide shade wherever she walked. They said that individual desires would destroy the stability of our society," she continued. "But when I read about human concepts like democracy and personal rights, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to make my own decisions about my life." Jiho found himself increasingly drawn to her curiosity and intelligence. She asked endless questions about Earth, about human culture, about his work as an archaeologist. Her genuine interest in learning about different ways of thinking was refreshing after years of dealing with academic colleagues who were often more interested in their own theories than in actual discovery. Meanwhile, Duke Corvain was not handling his defeat well. Jiho began noticing hostile stares from certain nobles whenever he appeared in public areas of the palace. Conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room, and he could feel the weight of unfriendly eyes following his movements. Princess Nara noticed it too. "Corvain has always been popular with the traditionalist faction," she warned Jiho, one evening as they shared a meal in her chambers. "They believe that our species is naturally superior to all others, and your victory challenges that belief. They see you not just as an individual threat, but as a symbol of everything they fear about change." "What exactly are they afraid of?" Jiho asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer, that if a human can win our sacred trials, then maybe we're not as superior as we've always believed, that maybe other species have things to teach us, that maybe our old ways aren't the only ways. She paused, looking thoughtful. Honestly, those are the same things that excite me most about getting to know you. As they spent more time together, both of them began to realize that what had started as a political arrangement was slowly becoming something much more personal. They discovered they both loved exploring ancient mysteries, though from different perspectives. They both enjoyed long conversations about philosophy and ethics, and they both had a sense of humor that others often found inappropriate for their respective positions. But lurking beneath these growing feelings was the constant awareness that not everyone in the palace was happy about this unprecedented situation, and that some of those unhappy people had both the power and the motivation to do something about it. The attack came at dawn, when the palace was quiet and most of the guards were changing shifts. Jiho had been unable to sleep, still adjusting to the strange rhythm of this alien world, with its 3 moons and 18-hour days. He was standing on the balcony of his guest chambers, watching the first sun rise over the crystal spires of the city, when he heard the soft whisper of movement behind him. His archaeological training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, and something felt wrong about the footsteps approaching. They were too careful, too deliberate. Normal palace servants didn't move like that. He spun around just as a dark figure lunged toward him with what looked like a blade made of pure energy. Jiho threw himself sideways, the energy weapon missing him by inches and leaving a glowing scar in the crystal wall where his head had been. The assassin was wearing dark robes that covered his face, but his height and build were unmistakably Veltharian. As he raised the weapon for another strike, Jiho did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed a decorative vase from a nearby table and hurled it at his attacker. The vase shattered against the assassin's shoulder, causing him to stumble backward. Jiho used that moment to shout for help at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the crystal corridors of the palace. But instead of palace guards responding to his calls, more dark figures emerged from the shadows. He was surrounded by at least 5 assassins, all carrying similar energy weapons. "The human contamination ends here," one of them hissed in accented English. "Your species will not corrupt our pure bloodline." Just as the assassins closed in, the chamber doors burst open. Princess Nara stormed in wearing her nightclothes, but carrying what appeared to be some kind of advanced weapon that hummed with deadly energy. Her usually calm demeanor was replaced by fierce determination as she took in the scene. "Stand down. Immediately," she commanded, her voice carrying the full authority of her royal position. "Anyone who harms my chosen consort will answer to me personally." The assassins hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting royal interference. That hesitation was their mistake. Princess Nara's weapon discharged with a sound like controlled lightning, creating an energy net that trapped 2 of the attackers instantly. But 3 others managed to escape through the balcony, using some kind of flying devices to disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. "Are you hurt?" Princess Nara asked, rushing to Jiho's side and checking him for injuries with surprising gentleness. "I'm okay," Jiho gasped, still trying to process what had just happened. "But I think we have a bigger problem than just a few angry nobles." Princess Nara nodded grimly as she secured the captured assassins with energy restraints. This wasn't a random attack. Someone organized this, someone with enough influence to coordinate multiple attackers and provide them with military-grade weapons. Over the next few hours, as palace security investigated the attack, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The captured assassins, when questioned, revealed that they were part of a larger conspiracy led by Duke Corvain and supported by several prominent noble families. Their goal was not just to eliminate Jiho, but to use his death as a rallying point for a movement to expel all non-Veltharian species from their empire. "They're calling it the Purity Initiative," Princess Nara explained, as she and Jiho met with High Chancellor Viridian in his private office. They claim that contact with other species weakens our genetic and cultural superiority. Jiho felt a chill as he recognized the dangerous ideology behind these words. This sounds familiar. Humans have dealt with similar thinking throughout Our history, and it never ends well. High Chancellor Viridian looked troubled. We have suspected for some time that Duke Corvain was building support among the traditionalist factions, but we had no proof of illegal activities. This assassination attempt gives us the evidence we need, but it also reveals how deeply this conspiracy reaches into our government. Princess Nara stood up, her eyes blazing with determination. Then we need to expose them before they can strike again. But we'll need to be smart about it. They'll be expecting us to react with traditional Veltharian methods. Jiho had an idea. What if we use that against them? They're planning for you to respond like a typical Veltharian noble, with formal challenges and legal proceedings. But what if we do something completely unexpected? Working together, they developed a plan that combined Princess Nara's knowledge of Veltharian politics with Jiho's human instinct for unconventional thinking. Instead of confronting the conspirators directly, they would gather evidence by pretending that Jiho had been more seriously injured than he actually was. If they think I'm weak and vulnerable, Jiho explained, they might get careless and reveal more of their network trying to finish the job. The plan worked perfectly. Over the next few days, as word spread that the human was recovering from serious injuries, several more conspirators revealed themselves by attempting to gain access to his chambers. Each attempt was carefully monitored and recorded, building an undeniable case against the entire network. The final piece of evidence came when Duke Corvain himself was caught, trying to bribe palace guards to allow him access to Jiho's supposedly vulnerable location. When confronted with the accumulated evidence, the conspiracy collapsed completely. As they stood together watching Duke Corvain being led away in restraints, Princess Nara took Jiho's hand. "We make a good team," she said softly. "Your human creativity and my Veltharian knowledge. Together we can solve problems that neither of us could handle alone." Jiho squeezed her hand gently, feeling their bond growing stronger through shared adversity. "Maybe that's what your empire needs more, of different species working together instead of staying isolated." High Chancellor Viridian, who had been observing their teamwork throughout the crisis, nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is time for our people to learn new ways of thinking, and perhaps you two are exactly the teachers we need." The second wedding ceremony was completely different from the interrupted disaster that had brought Jiho and Princess Nara together. This time, the Great Hall was filled not just with Veltharian nobles, but with representatives from dozens of different species throughout the galaxy. The crystal pillars had been decorated with flowers and symbols from many worlds, creating a celebration that honored multiple cultures rather than just one. Jiho stood at the altar, wearing robes that combined human and Veltharian design elements, feeling both nervous and amazed at how much his life had changed. Just months ago, he had been a lonely archaeologist, digging through ancient ruins on remote planets. Now he was about to marry an alien princess and become part of galactic history. Princess Nara looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, but what struck Jiho most was the genuine happiness in her eyes. This wasn't the resigned acceptance he had seen during her first wedding attempt. This was a woman who was choosing her own destiny and loving every moment of it. The ceremony itself had been redesigned to incorporate traditions from both their species. They exchanged vows in both languages, with Jiho speaking his promises in carefully practiced Veltharian, while Nara responded in surprisingly fluent English. When they sealed their union with the traditional Veltharian light-binding ritual, the energy that surrounded them pulsed with colors that represented harmony between different worlds. The celebration that followed lasted for 3 days and became the talk of the entire galaxy. Representatives from species that had barely acknowledged each other's existence found themselves working together to create new forms of art, music, and technology. Jiho watched in amazement as human musicians collaborated with Veltharian composers to create songs that neither species could have imagined alone. But the real changes began after the celebration ended. Princess Nara, now formally recognized as Empress-in-Waiting, announced that she and Jiho would be establishing a new diplomatic corps dedicated to building bridges between different civilizations. Their first mission was to visit Earth, where Jiho would serve as an ambassador to help his own species understand the opportunities that galactic cooperation could provide. The journey to Earth took several weeks aboard a Veltharian starship, giving the newlyweds time to plan their approach. Jiho was nervous about returning home, knowing that many humans would struggle to accept his alien wife and the radical changes she represented. "What if they reject everything we're trying to build?" he asked Nara as they stood together on the ship's observation deck, watching Earth grow larger in the viewing screen. Nara smiled and took his hand. "Then we'll do what we did with the conspiracy against us. We'll be patient, we'll be creative, and we'll show them through our actions that cooperation is better than isolation." Their arrival on Earth created a sensation. News networks covered every moment of the first official diplomatic visit from the Veltharian Empire, and millions of people gathered to catch a glimpse of the alien princess who had chosen a human husband. But what impressed people most wasn't Nara's exotic beauty or advanced technology. It was the obvious love and respect between her and Jiho, and the way they worked together as genuine partners. Over the following months, they established exchange programs that allowed young humans to study on Veltharian worlds, while Veltharian students learned about human culture on Earth. They helped negotiate trade agreements that benefited both species, and they worked together to solve problems that had seemed impossible when each civilization tried to handle them alone. The real test of their partnership came when they encountered a crisis on a distant world where two species had been at war for generations. Traditional diplomacy had failed completely, with both sides refusing to trust outside mediators. But Jiho and Nara's combination of human flexibility and Veltharian wisdom allowed them to find solutions that no one else had considered. "You know what I love most about this?" Nara said one evening as they sat together reviewing reports from their latest successful negotiation. "We're not just building bridges between our species, we're showing everyone that different perspectives make everything stronger." Jiho nodded, looking out at the stars that no longer seemed impossibly distant. "My grandmother used to tell me that the best discoveries come from the most unexpected places. I never imagined that accidentally crashing a wedding would lead to discovering a whole new way of living." Years later, as they traveled from world to world in their specially designed diplomatic ship, their story became legend throughout the galaxy. They had proven that love could transcend not just cultural differences, but biological ones as well. More importantly, they had demonstrated that cooperation between different species could solve problems and create possibilities that no single civilization could achieve alone. Their children, when they came, would grow up in a galaxy where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where the combination of human adaptability and Veltharian wisdom had opened doorways to discoveries that previous generations could never have imagined. And it all began with one human archaeologist who took a wrong step through an ancient portal and ended up in the right place at exactly the right time.